Hi, good evening, everyone, and welcome to another edition of our Justice and Peace's guest speaker series. Today, we continue on learning more about the paralegal venture candidates. Happy St. Patrick's Day for anyone that's watching this live. And as well as always, the views and opinions are of the candidates and the candidates alone. They don't reflect me, Justice and Peace's, Trials College, or any other organization or education institution I'm affiliated with. Today, we're really happy to have Deborah join us. Deborah, I don't know if it's like the third or fourth time, maybe in the 3 years I've had you on, but very different this time because you are running for Venture. So maybe you can tell me, first of all, for those who may not have heard you before, tell a little bit more about yourself.
Sure. So again, my name is Deborah Moriah. I am a paralegal working in Toronto. I'm actually from Nova Scotia, believe it or not. I don't think many people know that, but I was born in New Brunswick, raised in Nova Scotia, and Toronto is my home. I've been here for over 23 years. So a little bit about me. I have a social justice background. Like my family is actually heavily involved in social justice in many different aspects. And so I've actually seen it in my life for quite a long time. I grew up that way, just seeing the way that we were taught that people needed help and that we were there to help people as much as we could. So that's really where my life started and how things started off with this interest in justice. I actually started as an editor in my career, an editor and a writer, a technical writer. I still do that, but it's funny, I would always gravitate towards the type of work that would help people. And the other day, a family member of mine actually mentioned that I used to be, and I recall this, I used to be the go-to person to write, like, letters when you write to manufacturers or stores about things that went wrong with your product. People would always come to me to do that. And I loved doing that. And I think that at the time, I didn't realize I was practicing consumer protection before I'd even actually read the act or learned about it. And when I learned about it in school, I was like, oh, this is cool. Like in paralegal studies, I was like, oh, this is something that I can actually do. I naturally always gravitated towards this. So I've always been, again, passionate about helping people and making sure they're treated fairly. So I did work a little bit in small claims, but I quickly moved from small claims to human rights. And then over the past few years, I have started to work in equity, diversity, and inclusion. It's kind of always been at the core of what I do because of my own lived experience, but it was something that I found was more and more needed in almost every industry. And I had the knowledge. And so I started to share my knowledge. I started to be actually contracted by consultants who had been doing this work like as consultants for a long time, but were now being asked to provide an EDI perspective on things. And because of my background, I was actually contracted in an advisory role and then ended up starting to do that on my own. So right now I am working as an EDI specialist and an EDI consultant. One of the things I did over the past couple of years was found the Ontario Association of Black Paralegals. And I founded that organization because I wanted Black paralegals to have a safe space to address their concerns with discrimination and also grow their careers and find mentorship. And then on top of that, as the organization grew, we decided that we wanted to be more transparent about what people were experiencing in the industry as far as discrimination was concerned. And so we try to be very transparent with all paralegals about those experiences. So that's a little bit about me. And I'll just turn it back over to you because I'm sure you have more questions, but I won't go on too long.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess then, I know certainly from talking to you and over the last couple of years, at least, that all the different things you're doing. But now, there's a new initiative, right? Is that you're running for paralegal venture. So you can tell me a bit more about why you've decided to run and specifically why you're running as part of the Good Governance Coalition. And so we'll talk a little bit more about how all that works to follow.
Sure. So the venture initiative, I guess we're calling it, it's not something that I've ever considered before. I didn't even know what a venture was when someone asked me if I'd consider running. My immediate response was, that's not really for me. I don't really engage in politics in that way. And that's what I felt like this was. And it wasn't something I was interested in. And my excuse for that was that I was doing community work. I was doing the grassroots stuff that I had been doing for the past 3 years. And I felt that I was being impactful in that area. And I didn't think I could do the same type of work at the Law Society. And so I thought, why spend all this energy doing something where I'm not making change? But then as I learned more about what convocation is, what ventures are, and why we're there, I realized that there is room there for people who do community and grassroots work. There is room for people who want to see the change at that level. So I started doing my research and talking to more people and finding out more about the impact that I could have and the kinds of things that I could bring to convocation and the way that I could advocate for important changes at the LSO. And as I did that, I decided, maybe this is the right space for me. I kind of naturally gravitated to this in the first place. So maybe taking it to the next level isn't such a bad idea. So I made the decision to run. And running with the coalition, I mean, I'm doing it because I feel like it's important to serve on a board with people who, who are like-minded. I think that right now there is an issue with, there's a slate, as we all know, at the Law Society who doesn't want certain things to be passed. They want to get rid of other things like EDI, things that have an EDI perspective. They don't want that to be something that we're talking about. They're talking about stop woke now, and woke, really all woke is, if people don't really know, and I know it's a conversation that's been had over the past couple of weeks, is what really is woke. Woke is social awareness. And it's being aware of the people around you, and it's being aware of the things that they are experiencing. And it's recognizing that just because you haven't experienced it doesn't mean that it's not real. And so the idea that we as legal professionals, as people who are trying to accelerate justice, are trying to say that these things aren't real, that people's experiences aren't real, I don't agree with that. And I think that's why, running with the coalition was something that I felt was important, because I knew that they wanted to stop this from happening.
Now, I guess then the question then is, like, if the pendulum then swings completely in the opposite direction, right? I mean, just like in politics, when you go conservative and liberal, that isn't that also going to create, an issue in of itself, right? That, hey, we don't really like how we had this slate, so we're going to come together. But now we have our own coalition. So if we're all elected, then, maybe we're going to go too much in the opposite direction. So how would you kind of respond to that criticism that, what are you doing here? I mean, or is this just fighting fire with fire?
Yeah, and that is definitely a valid point. I understand why people might feel that that's what's happening, like that it doesn't make sense for us to be, again, fighting fire with fire. But I don't believe that that's what we're doing. The coalition was forced to take this move. We had to come together and pool our resources in order to stop what is happening at the Law Society right now and return it back to the way that it should be. Once we're elected, there is no plan for any member of the coalition to vote together, to vote on issues together. That's not the plan. The plan is for us to have our own agendas, which we all have. We all have our own unique ideas and our own agendas that are in the best interest of the public and ones that will also benefit licensees. So at that time, once the election is over, the coalition goes away. And I think people need to understand that with the slate, that's not what happens. The slate exists within the Law Society right now. They exist at convocation, and it's a problem.
Now you mentioned the agenda there, like everyone has kind of their own things. Perhaps maybe you can tell me a little bit more about what are the bullet points on your agenda?
So I have several bullet points. I would like to talk mainly about the one of expansion. So I think that expansion of scope is a really important issue at least for paralegals in the election. And I understand why that is. I know that it's been really frustrating for paralegals over the past few years who have been working in this industry for a long time, not to be able to grow in their careers. These are people who are well respected. They're people who are sought after. And despite the fact that they have what it takes to do the work, they're not able to do that because of limited scope. So I get where they're coming from. But the issue with expansion of scope is that not all paralegals are at the same level because education is not standardized. Education is different at different schools. And the Law Society has this responsibility to make sure that education for paralegals is the same across the board before scope can be expanded. And so I know that it is a complicated issue. I am interested in exploring how we do that. And I don't think that there is one way to do it. I think there are several initiatives that have to be put in place in order for that to happen. And some of those include, again, standardizing the paralegal education as it is right now, changing the way things are done. It may even include changing how people are accepted into those programs. It's going to definitely include changing how people are trained. Right now, there is the experiential learning program with the lawyer licensees that has great oversight at the Law Society. The Law Society ensures that students at law have the training that they need to become lawyers. With paralegals, I almost feel like we're forgotten when it comes to that. So a lot of times paralegals are off finding their own placements. there's not really a whole lot of guidance there. And I know the schools do the best they can, but I'm not sure that the schools have the capacity to ensure that thousands, literally, of students have the best placements. And I think that because the Law Society is responsible for accrediting these schools, they should also be responsible for ensuring that these schools have programs for students that allow them to get the best type of experience possible before they become paralegals, so that they're prepared. Another issue is we're looking at the amount of paralegals that are actually going out and practicing. So I believe in the last licensing round, only 25 paralegals were licensed. And that's really low. And we don't know why that is. We can speculate on all of the different reasons, but it could be that only 25 passed the exam. And if that's the case, then there's definitely an issue with education. It could also be that only 25 wanted to become paralegals because they felt confident enough. Again, that's still an issue with them not feeling like they have enough information to move forward into the actual profession. So there's a lot there. There's a lot to consider. I think that we need to work together to get that done. And I think that we can do it. I think when expanding scope and work, and for people who are working in the industry for many years, there may be a benefit to them actually being able to have some type of assessment like the NACs, something like that, that's tailored to our profession, so that these people who have been working for so long that have the expertise are able to grow in their profession, and that they don't have to be limited because scope is limited. I think it's really dangerous to rubber stamp the P1 license with expansion of scope at this point in time.
Yeah, so because I mean, every of the paralegal candidates I talk to, are mentioning obviously scope and that it should be expanded and different areas, and obviously there's potential legal arguments that may force the Law Society's hand, or as I think, they can certainly do away with the litigation and just say, okay, well, we're going to expand in these areas and put it to convocation. But everyone sort of has a different take on, essentially, well, if we get this scope, what's the transition to recognize that, right? Because I mean, you have some paralegals who were grandparented in, right, from prior to, I mean, there's been different iterations of the licensing exams, right? They went from 7 hours to 4.5 hours and things like that. And as you mentioned, I mean, obviously there's, and I can tell, because I mean, maybe I'm one of the people that have the most experience at different schools, right? I think in total I've taught, 20% of all the accredited colleges, right? That, that there are differences between them. But I guess the question then is, as you brought up, is, do you think that the internship component should then be taken out of sort of the college overview and brought, kind of like you mentioned, articling within the Law Society's oversight, right? I mean, it's certainly going to be a lot of time and money, and the challenges that we're experiencing with articling jobs right now, maybe because it's a shorter 2-month period, maybe that's not as big of a concern. But looking at all of that, and do you think that's something that the Law Society should have direct oversight over, or indirect oversight as they have now, where they certainly accredit the programs, and when they come in and do an audit and check, they do check to see, hey, who are going out on internships, what are they doing, and are obviously are they in the scope of their practice? So maybe you can elaborate a little bit more on how you would see better Law Society oversight in terms of that area.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that the Law Society should be heavily involved in that process. They are with the lawyers. And I think the argument for not expanding scope is that paralegals aren't competent. So how do we change that? And I don't think you can change that if they don't have these experiences, like practical experiences, to the same level and quality that the lawyers do. That's never going to change if they're going out and getting placements and doing filing and answering phones. Like, you're not getting what you need. I had the privilege of doing my placement with a lawyer who also went on to mentor me. And on my very first day, he sent me to court. And I remember how terrified I was, because I was, but at the same time, it was such an amazing experience. And I had those experiences throughout the entire 4 months that I was there. But I had that privilege because my brother is actually a lawyer, and it was one of his colleagues who decided to take me on. But I found that placement on my own. Most of the classmates that I had at that time had placements, again, at places where they were just doing filing, or they were literally sitting around doing nothing, and they had, no work. And so that's a problem. And so I do believe that the Law Society should somehow oversee it. I know that there are challenges there. I completely recognize that there are challenges, because you have to think about the fact that we're dealing with public and private colleges. Private colleges don't have the same amount of funding. And so, if the Law Society were to just say, this is how the experiential learning program for paralegals must be, and then leave it to the colleges, not everybody is, there's an issue with equity there, because not everybody is able to do it at the same level because they don't have the same amount of funding. And so how do we fix that issue? So it is a complicated issue. It's something to explore. I certainly don't have all of the answers. I just know that having done some of my research with independent research, having talked to several new students, new paralegals, and existing students that have been there for quite some time, students that have done their placements with me, what they're lacking is that experience, and that's what makes them afraid to go out into the field. I had a conversation with a student the other day who I asked, are you licensed? And the response was, oh, I will be, but I'm waiting to get experience first. If students are thinking that way, then there's an issue with the education, because when you come out of school, you should already have that experience. That shouldn't be something that you feel you now need to figure out on your own. And then on top of that, we need to think about how students are getting mentorship. And I know that that's not necessarily the Law Society's responsibility, but what do we do? How do we create maybe CPD programs that are actually beneficial to students and help them get this type of information that they need? And I know the Law Society is starting to do that now, but there's still a lot more work that can be done there.
I'm going to come back, but I mean, you brought up your brother, and I think I didn't want to forget about this, because when we talk about expansion of scope, usually the basis of where there's been a problem is because the lawyers are protecting their turf, right? Is one of the arguments I hear. Well, immigration lawyers don't want us to take their business because we can maybe do it at a more affordable rate, and therefore they're going to lose base. The same thing was why there was the erosion of the family law service provider in the end, from what was kind of from all the reports into what was delivered in the end. I mean, I'm not sure how often there's the holiday dinner table where your brother and yourself are sort of sitting down, and this us versus them kind of mentality that some people are sort of framing this as. But I mean, how do you sort of see that as licensees, right, lawyer or paralegal, and again, even on your coalition, right, that there are lawyer candidates and paralegal candidates for venture? How do we work together? I mean, or is it something that we, inherent tension that we can't, and it's the scope has to come kind of through paralegals kind of pushing that forward rather than bringing it through convocation?
I definitely think that lawyers and paralegals are capable of working together. I've seen it. I'm doing it. So my brother that I mentioned, he's actually on the board of directors for the Ontario Association of Black Paralegals. He's one of the founding members. He's very pro paralegal. The people that he works with paralegals frequently, he refers cases to them. The people that I'm running with on the coalition, those people, they endorse the paralegal profession. They understand the necessity. They understand that we need it to accelerate access to justice. I think the mentality that lawyers versus paralegals, I understand that some people have had that experience. I personally have had that experience where I have lawyers who don't treat me necessarily very well because I am a paralegal, but I don't believe that that's across the board. And I also don't believe that lawyers are necessarily protecting their turf. I'm sure there are some who are, but I don't believe that they all are. And if we think about the immigration bar, for instance, and I won't talk too much about immigration because it is before the courts, but I will say this, the immigration bar, having worked in immigration, is very small. And so not a lot of lawyers work in that area. It's a highly specialized area, but I also recognize that there are paralegals who have been working in immigration for a long time and do have what it takes to do the work. And so it's something that we need to come together to talk about and figure out. And I think it's possible for lawyers and paralegals to figure it out. I really do.
Now, again, we don't necessarily know how it's going to come down, in May the 1st, I think is the results are known. But again, do you think by the fact that you've been having all sorts of discussions and meetings and town halls and things like that with your fellow good governance coalition candidates, that if some of them are ultimately elected, does that kind of put better trust in the fact that if, expansion of scope comes to a committee and then goes to the full convocation, that there's going to be support there, whether it's immigration, whether it's reviewing family law or divisional court or whatever. Do you think that's a better route in terms of then kind of being this sort of standoff to say, hey, we need this, the lawyers are not giving to us, if we don't get it, then maybe we should go to the government and ask for self-regulation?
Well, the one thing I can say to that is that we are a group of people who are willing to collaborate. And I think that that's really important. I think once you've built relationships and you've had these conversations, they know what conversations paralegals are having. They know what our platforms are. They know how we want to change the profession and how we want to advance the profession. And they're willing to have those conversations with us. I have no idea what the future holds. I don't know how that will turn out, but I am confident that working with the coalition and working with people in the coalition will be a benefit to us as paralegals, because they are people that are supportive of the profession. I can't say honestly the same for the slate. I've heard that they're not that supportive of the profession. I've heard of experiences paralegals have had with some of those lawyers. So I don't know that those are people that would work with us necessarily. But I do know that the people that I'm working with right now are willing to have those conversations with us.
And I guess let's continue back with the education there, right? Because where we were at was discussing essentially, how can we improve the overall competence, right? I guess because if you're going to expand the scope, are we in fact, or are paralegals in fact competent in those new areas, right? Some will say yes by virtue of the analogy of, well, hey, I studied small claims and I practiced POA, and 8 years later, I want to now do landlord tenant, and I can because it's within my scope. So now 8 to 10 years later, if I want to do immigration, how is that any different, right? So what would you say in terms of, getting that competency, if it's needed in that way, and then as well, getting those 27 votes in support of, expansion? Like what kind of needs to be done to better get a gauge in the public interest that we want expanded scope, but we also want to make sure it's competent in that the public isn't getting people who don't know what they're doing. I mean, again, that doesn't mean it can't be lawyers that make those same mistakes, or immigration consultants, or agents, right? But how do we kind of balance sort of on both sides, expanded scope but competence?
And I think that, like I said earlier, it requires several different initiatives. I don't think there's one answer. So I don't think the answer is rubber stamping the P1 license and expanding the scope for everyone, because then you have all of these different levels of competence, and you run the risk of people going out, like we talked about earlier, and doing things that they don't necessarily know how to do. But on the other side of that, again, we have people who have been working in this field for years and have that competence, but just are limited because of the scope. And so how do we assess their skills and allow them to expand their scope, but also assess the skills of newer paralegals, or paralegals that literally have just started, or paralegals who have been focused on one area and that's all they know? And I think it's important to note that with lawyers, I don't think I've ever met a lawyer who has practiced in more than 2 or 3 areas of law. Even though they are allowed to, I've never met a lawyer who's done that. And so I think it's important also to note that when they start school, they normally have an idea of what it is that they want to practice. And that idea of what they want to practice, so say they want to be criminal lawyers, that's their focus throughout their entire schooling. So they're focusing on courses that will help them do that. They're articling on something that will help them do that. And so they're streamed in a certain area so that they can provide those services. And sometimes they overlap, like sometimes criminal and immigration will overlap, sometimes criminal and civil will overlap, but a lot of lawyers will stick to 2 to 3 areas. Mostly, I've never seen a lawyer in 3 areas, but I've seen them in 2 areas at the very most, providing 2 different types of law, but specialize in those areas because that's what they learned in school. That's what their focus was. And I think it's important for paralegals to understand that if we want expansion of scope, we need to have those same benefits. We need to be able to stream our education in order to get that. And again, I recognize that there are people who have been grandfathered in, they've been working for years, and they've streamed it by virtue of their experience, and they deserve the opportunity to have that assessed.
I mean, that is one notable difference, I guess, from comparing my time in law school versus all the years now I've been teaching in various schools at their paralegal programs, is that there are not as many kind of electives, right? In terms of hey, you know what, I'm really interested in landlord and tenant board. Are there any additional courses I can do from that? I mean, is that something, again, that the law study can look at, or is this something maybe after you finish, right? I mean, the other thing is, no, it's not like education stops the day, you walk across and then get your diploma, right? Or your degree. But what would you see in terms of looking at, you're pointing out some of these specialties, let's say, of kind of connecting from what you're learning in school and then what you may be practicing later on. And of course, there are students like myself, maybe, that, they took a bunch of courses in law school, and when they finished law school, they wanted to do something different, right? I mean, the same thing can happen, obviously, for paralegal students, right? But kind of how would you look at all of that in terms of getting the education in place?
Well, for the education, I think that the programs themselves can change. I think right now we have, I believe there are 3 different types of paralegal programs. So there is the 1-year accelerated program. So if you already have your bachelor's degree, you can do that program. There's a 2-year program that you do straight out of high school, and then there's a 4-year program. I believe the 4-year programs have the potential to offer that type of streaming, to offer electives and allow paralegals to choose where they want to be. And I agree. I mean, you could literally go through all of that and then change your mind completely. I mean, I'm a paralegal now, and I started off as an editor. And I think when I first started, I wanted to be a journalist. So I get that we change our minds, but changing our minds doesn't mean that we just get to jump from one thing to the next. I think we still need to be competent in those areas, especially in this industry, because we are here for the benefit of the public. We can't just be out there dabbling. We need to know what we're doing. And I recognize that there are some paralegals that do know what they're doing, but not all paralegals do. And so we have to be able to make sure that whatever initiatives we put in place to expand scope address those complications, because we don't want to say everyone can do it and then have the public at risk of being served by people who don't know what they're doing. But at the same time, people who do know what they're doing deserve the opportunity to provide those services.
And I mean, getting back then to, okay, so they've gone through school, right? I mean, at this point, many different experiences, right? I mean, what's kind of done is done. And now the law society obviously is regulating paralegals and will continue to regulate paralegals, right? In terms of finding and addressing any of those gaps, right? And then the big one that comes up is, as you pointed out, is, well, how many are going through the licensing process? And I was actually just talking to some of my students who, we went out yesterday and sort of celebrated. They wrote their exams last week, and they were sharing kind of the same kind of anxiety of, well, what am I going to do next? And first of all, I want to get that pass, and then what am I going to do next? And is that, again, more of what kind of mentorship can the law society be doing? Or, I mean, like you have the Ontario Association of Black Paralegals, and then there's, the Ontario Paralegal Association, and anyone can essentially create their own kind of mentorship or support network. But I mean, is that something that can be coming outside of the law society, or is that something that should be coming from within the law society, or is it a combination of both?
I think it's a combination of both. I think we can work together. These associations can work with the Law Society to provide that type of mentorship. And I know for a fact that the Law Society is open to that. In October of last year, we actually had a CPD during Access to Justice Week with OABP and the Law Society, where we were talking about different areas of law that paralegals can practice that are unusual. And we actually had paralegals from different paths come on that CPD and tell the viewers about what type of law they practice and how they got there. So I think the Law Society is open to opening up that conversation with students and with existing paralegals. I think they're open to having some type of mentorship initiative. They do have something right now, the Coach and Advisor Network. And I think they're looking at expanding that as well so that it's more beneficial to paralegals. I can personally say that when I first started out as a paralegal, I had no idea where to go. OABP obviously didn't exist yet. That was where that idea came from. I was looking, I thought, where can I go for mentorship? And I did try the Coach and Advisor Network. That was the old program. It didn't work out well for me. I ended up being matched with someone who had never been in private practice. So it didn't go anywhere past one conversation. But I do think that there is a possibility for us to work with the Law Society to make that happen. I don't know whether or not it's absolutely their responsibility. I don't think it is. And I also think that the organizations like, OABP, OPA, York Paralegal Network, they are open to and have been providing that type of programming for students, for new paralegals, for existing paralegals. We're open to doing this type of work and working with the Law Society to do it. We just need to have that conversation and be open to collaborating.
Now, with programs like these, and certainly, we were talking about the Stop Woke before. Maybe now it's a good time, obviously, to look at this in more detail, because I know certainly equity, diversity, inclusion are things that are important to you. But is that sort of, in terms of, is this the Law Society? Like, how hands-on does the Law Society need to be? Because of course, I want to talk to people on the other side, and they're going to say, well, stop woke or stop bloat and stop creep, because the focus should be on the public interest and making sure that the profession is dealing with no one's running money out of their trust account and issues like that. But I mean, how do you kind of look at that sort of counterpoint with the importance equity, diversity, and inclusion is to you and in your platform here?
Yeah, well, I mean, at the end of the day, the Law Society's mandate is to protect and to make sure that the people of Ontario have the best services possible. And I think that the people of Ontario deserve to be represented by people who look like them. I think that if you are a person who is a person of color, you are, I don't know, anybody who's experienced any type of discrimination, you deserve to be protected in that area. So if you're coming to legal professionals, to lawyers or paralegals for support or services, you deserve to be protected in that area. Like, why not? And if the Law Society's mandate is to protect the people of Ontario and ensure they're getting those services in the right way, then of course they need to address equity, diversity, and inclusion. So it's something that is a real thing. Again, wokeness is really just a term to talk about social awareness. And we have to understand that the people that we may serve experience things that we may have never experienced, but that doesn't mean that those things aren't real. And we have to be able to understand that. Like, when you're providing services to your client, you can't be doing it from a lens that is your own. You have to understand what your client's been through, especially if you're working in human rights, if you're working in immigration. All of these areas require you to have that lens. And so while I know the Law Society can't necessarily mandate that you act in a certain way or have a statement of principles, they can, I think it is definitely their responsibility to address equity, diversity, and inclusion and ensure that people who are providing legal services to the people of Ontario, also a province which happens to have it happens to be very diverse compared to other provinces in Canada, they definitely need to be bringing that up. And they need to make sure that that people who are serving these people are aware of the issues that they face.
And so how should they be bringing it up, right? Because again, you brought up the statement of principles there that was sort of the birth there of the Stop group, or Full Stop Now, in terms of their position being there's overreach here, right? I mean, it shouldn't be done by the Law Society, and now looking at other things, right? And again, I don't necessarily know exactly, and I'll get that opportunity to talk to them more, I hope. But what's the response there in terms of how exactly this should be looking at in terms of, again, it goes going back to with maybe this should be working or collaborating with some other organizations, but the Law Society itself, I mean, what should they be doing in this field?
I think the Law Society should continue doing what the Law Society is doing. We need to continue to address EDI, and we do that through CPD. And we do that by asking lawyers and paralegals to make sure that they have a certain requirement when it comes to CPD to help them understand what equity, diversity, and inclusion is. I think the issue with EDI and the reason why there are people who don't understand it is because they simply don't understand it. They don't know what those terms mean. They don't understand that EDI doesn't just necessarily apply to somebody who is a person of color. It applies to somebody with different abilities. It applies to somebody with different socioeconomic status. There are so many things under the umbrella of EDI. And I think the more that people take the time to understand it, the more that they will be on board with it. And I do want to point out, though, too, that with the Law Society, we say that things should always be the way that they've always been. I think that's kind of the way that they want to frame it. They don't think the Law Society should change what they've always done. But, 200 years ago, the Law Society did not license Black individuals. They weren't allowed to be lawyers. So even though they would go to school and do all of these things and have the teaching and the experience they weren't allowed to be at the Law Society and be licensed individuals. That's changed. If the Law Society didn't change the way they thought about things and they thought about people's experiences and different individuals, where would we be right now? So should we just stop growth? Is that, at the end, it's stop woke, stop bloat, stop growth? Like, we have to keep growing. And I think that as a society, we have continued to grow, especially over the past few years, and the Law Society can't be exempt from that.
Now, I just wanted to see if there was any, we've talked about on the education front, we've talked about EDI here. I mean, going back to, your platform and your vision and the agenda that, you might have, what other bullet points, that we haven't talked about yet that you think are important, and a reason if people, paralegal candidates or paralegals are listening to you and all the other paralegal candidates, why they should be supporting you?
Yeah, so, I think one of the most important things is that you need to look for people that are representing the law or representing the profession at the Law Society in a professional manner. So that's why I believe, as far as the people that I'm running with, that's why I'm asking people to vote for us. We're people who have experience. We're people who have been doing this for quite some time. We know how to approach issues. We know how to be tactful and diplomatic in approaching issues. It's not about, running forward and saying, this is what I want and I won't accept anything less. It's about collaboration. So we need people who are willing to do that, willing to collaborate. Some of the other things that I'm looking at as far as my platform is concerned is I'm looking at ways for paralegals to get more mentorship. So in accordance with education, mentorship, it comes into play there. The Law Society, like I said, worked with us in October to put on this program for Access to Justice Week. And I'm looking at ways, and I know that it's not necessarily in the mandate of the Law Society, but I do know they're open to it, at providing more mentorship programming and networking for paralegals, especially new paralegals. And not just in Toronto, but across all regions. So opportunities for paralegals to go to maybe career fairs and learn more about the different opportunities that are out there. I think the Law Society, if they're going to be regulating our profession and they're going to tell us what our scope is, they need to be more transparent about what our scope is. There's so much about what paralegals can do that we don't know. We get stuck in certain areas and we never learn about other things that we can do. I had a conversation with a student just today. I shouldn't even say student. She just finished her exam and is working on licensing right now. And she wanted to know what next, like, what do I do? And I shared with her information about condominium law. And she was so excited because she didn't know about it. And students should be able to learn these things. Like, new paralegals coming into the profession should have that information, and the Law Society should make it readily available.
Yeah, and I think certainly, I mean, and like I said, I had that exact same conversation with 7 students. A couple of them are just got their license actually this week, and the rest of them were waiting for the exam results. And again, that same thing there in terms of what next, right? And the numbers, Treasurer Teresa Donnelly used to come and do a presentation, and I've heard it so many times from the different schools I was at. But one of the things that always stuck out to me was, well, what are the numbers in all the different fields, right? And then how many are actually still, that they go through the process, they get licensed, and then they go and do something differently.
Yeah.
And so what more, in terms of the Law Society, I mean, certainly perhaps starting with why is this happening? But in terms of the mentorship you brought up, what can the Law Society be doing to address this gap of licensed but not practicing? And then maybe you look at it 3 years down the road and 5 years, kind of like a funnel, and sort of what's the root cause and what can we do to deal with that?
Well, I think the first thing is transparency. I don't think we really know why. We don't know. And I don't know how transparent the Law Society can be with this, but when we're looking at the numbers that we're seeing, this is how many were licensed, how many wrote the exam, like why, how many are actually going from being licensed, writing the exam and passing into their licensing. So just because you pass the exam doesn't mean you're licensed. Maybe there's a problem with money. Maybe people can't afford to be licensed immediately. And that's why one of the other things on my platform is fee equity, because we have to recognize that not everybody starts at the same place. So while I may be able to do my exam, pass my exam, go out right away and open up my own practice, not everybody has that capability. Not everybody has the funds to do that. So how do we look at new licensees and ensure that they continue on with their license, even though they're not working yet? I think fee assessment is an important thing. A lot of organizations do it, where how much you pay is based on whether or not you're working, whether you're working at all, whether you're working part-time. And I know that that is a difficult conversation. People don't necessarily love to talk about money, but I think it's important. We have to understand that we don't all come from the same place. We don't all start at the same place. And so we need to consider equity as far as fees are concerned. I also think we need to consider parental leave. There actually is a gap in parental leave where, if a person was to, a family was to become pregnant within, I guess, the first year of being licensed, there isn't really anything in place for parental leave. So you would just be administratively suspended for not, because you have to take parental leave, because you have to take off time to go and raise your children. The other thing too is even the term administratively suspended. Some of these things they seem so innocent and they're terms that we always use. But if you're thinking about the public who has full access to the directory, and they're going on to the paralegal and lawyer directory, especially the paralegal directory, and they're looking at the names and they're looking at the fact that this person's suspended, that person's suspended, even though it says administratively suspended, and we understand what that means, the public doesn't necessarily understand that. So how do we reframe that language to make sure that the public has the confidence that the Law Society is licensing people who know what they're doing or who can handle the profession? Because right now, seeing a list of people that are suspended makes the public think maybe there's something going on with paralegals. And I don't like that. I don't want paralegals to be put in that light. I think that we are competent professionals. We have the confidence if we are given the mentorship and the education that reflects our competence. So I really, really want the Law Society to take that seriously.
So a couple of points that you brought up there. I mean, one is in terms of the fees that are paid, right? I mean, does it make sense? Obviously, a big Bay Street law firm, that's bringing in so much, millions, let's say, in terms of client revenue, pay essentially the same amount as another lawyer, and the same thing you can say with a practicing paralegal, with a paralegal that does a little bit of work, right, or someone that's in education, right, as someone like myself, that the bulk of your money is not coming from your practice, but you're still, the percentage breakdown of your revenue compared to the licensing, the insurance and the annual dues is, it's bigger and bigger because the less that you're bringing in.
Yeah.
And then even for those who are not practicing at all, it's not like they don't pay anything, right? I mean, part of the reason people get administratively suspended is, they stop paying the Law Society fees of 25% or whatever it is, and then they get suspended. Right. So, I mean, maybe you could look at that more in terms of, I mean, does that make any sense? Like what are they paying for?
Right. Well, that's true. And so I think that's part of the problem. So we're saying that, the profession is hemorrhaging paralegals, like no one's staying. But why aren't they staying? Like, why would you, like, we have to look at why people aren't staying. Like, why aren't they paying for this license? What are they getting from it if they are paying for it? So these are questions that we have to ask people. And I think we won't figure it out on our own. I don't think we can get together in convocation and figure it out on our own. We have to talk to paralegals to find out why. We need to have that conversation with them to find out, why am I not paying this fee? Why do I not feel like it's worth it? Or even once I finish my exam, why do I not feel like it's worth it to pay all of this money? From students that I've talked to recently, it's because why would I pay this much money for my license if I'm not ready? So there's a lot of different reasons why people are doing this. We need to make sure that we are transparent and willing to have that conversation with licensees to understand where they're coming from.
And Deborah, again, as we look to kind of slowly move into the conclusion here, we've talked quite a bit of number of different things. I just wanted to make sure that there's nothing else we haven't missed that you want to address there in terms of this election and the things that are important to you.
Yeah, not really. I think I've covered most of the issues on my platform. I will be getting into more detail about them on my blog, just so that people have a better understanding of why I'm pushing for these things. Education, like I said, I'll say it again, I think is the most important thing. We really, really need to take a second look at that. Not even a second look, I'm sure it's a 10th look by now, but we really need to look at that and consider what would best benefit paralegals, what would best benefit students, and what would best benefit the people of Ontario. So yeah, I'm open to collaboration at all levels. With my organization, the Ontario Association of Black Paralegals, we are open to collaboration with other organizations. We want to make sure that we are able to do the work that we can together to help paralegals, but there's only so much that we can do as nonprofit organizations. We do need the assistance of the Law Society, who is our regulator.
Now, with certainly there's we've been looking at it from the good governance and full stop groups, but even amongst the other paralegal venture candidates, right? I mean, there could be some of your coalition elected and others. Mm-hmm. Do you sort of see that there's some consensus? I mean, whether it's on scope, that regardless of who is elected, that you wouldn't have an issue. Now, as you pointed out, even within your own coalition, right? That if Mike is going on about something, you don't necessarily agree with him, you don't have to support. But kind of how could you work, whether whoever the other four venture elects will be, sort of how can you work with them? Because again, then the larger conversation is the other 22 votes that we'll need, whether it's from the lay benchers or the lawyer benchers, to kind of get some of the things that seem to be keeping on coming up every person I talk to.
Right. I think with the paralegal benchers, especially because there's only 5 of us, I think it's important that whoever is elected, that we are able to come to that consensus that we can work together. We don't necessarily, again, have to agree on everything or even have the same things that we're advocating for, but I think it's important that we're open to conversation with each other. I think it's important also when it comes to our platforms that our platforms aren't wish lists, that they're things that are doable, and they're things that we can, places and issues that we can actually bring actionable change to. We need to be able to have those conversations with people who aren't necessarily benchers. We need to be open to that. We can't say, okay, I've been elected, now I make all the decisions. We need to be open to have those conversations with other paralegals. We need to know what they're looking for. And I'm willing to work with anyone, provided that we're professional in the way that we do it.
Perfect. So we've talked a lot about education there, and certainly you may remember, I probably asked you this question a couple of times before, but what are some words of wisdom that you have for any of the students or the not yet licensed paralegals that are out there watching this and trying to learn more about bencher elections and the paralegal profession?
I think the biggest thing I always say to students is expand your network. I don't think people realize how important it is to start building your network before you even get into the profession. So even if you're in school right now and it's like literally your first semester, start building your network. Get on LinkedIn, start going to events and meeting people. We had an event in February with young women in law, and there were so many students there, and it was amazing to meet with them because they were so eager to understand, what this profession is all about and how can I meet people now. And I think it's really important that students do that because, again, there isn't anything necessarily in place for training that is standardized. But if you're putting yourself in these spaces where you're able to meet with seasoned paralegals, seasoned lawyers, you're able to put yourself in a place where you can possibly get placements or mentorships or sponsorships with these people. So make sure that you open up your network. And I know it can be hard. Believe it or not, I'm an extreme introvert. Well, not an extreme. I am an introvert. I don't think I'm an extreme introvert anymore, but I had to break myself out of that shell. And so even if you feel like you're a little shy, bring a friend with you, bring a few friends with you, but do your best to get out there and meet people. I think that's the most important piece of advice that I can give students.
Perfect. Thank you, Deborah, again for taking the time and joining us. It's always nice every year or so to hear from you. I leave you with the last question, I guess the most important question, right? Is any of the paralegals that are watching this and are getting ready to vote in the next month, why should they cast their vote for you, Deborah, and by extension for any of the coalition members that you also support?
Well, thank you, JP, for having me here and just for the opportunity to share my platform and a little bit more about, the things that I'm trying to advance at the Law Society. I would ask paralegals to vote for us because we're experienced. We are experienced board members. We understand what it takes, to affect the real change at the LSO. We've worked on building relationships. We have relationships with lawyers and paralegals alike, and we take those relationships seriously. We understand that having relationships will help us make the difference. It will help us be able to have difficult conversations. Also, as I mentioned earlier, our platforms, they're not wish lists. These are based on research, real conversations with individuals who know what's doable. They're based on this desire for real actionable change. And again, we're open to conversation. Like, we want to talk to paralegals and understand what it is that they're looking for. We don't just have our set list of things that we want to do and aren't open to listening to anyone else. I myself, I can't speak for the rest of the coalition, but I can speak for myself. I'm always open to talk and listen to ideas. So my phone number to my business is online. People can call me anytime. You can message me on LinkedIn. You can email me. I'm very responsive. I love meeting new people. And then finally, I just want to say that, I'm in this not for myself. I'm not a bencher. I'm not trying to be a bencher because it's some goal of mine. As I mentioned to you earlier, I had to take some time to think about it before I decided that I wanted to do it. And I realized that I'm in this for the profession and for the people of Ontario. And so I asked for your vote. I ask that you would vote for people who are willing to make the change that needs to be made at the Law Society, and change that's possible.
Perfect. Thanks again, Deborah, and happy St. Patrick's Day there to all that's watching. Take care, and see you next week.
Thank you, JP.